Right, this is the second video of chapter 13 about is leisure fair. So in this video, we're going to start to talk about those concepts about some of the negative factors, prohibition, and some of the positive factors, permissions. That's what they call chapter. Anyway, did you notice how the chapter talked about the concept and the word called equity, right? Equity, equity, equity. Now, it was interesting, probably, maybe some of you found that equity interesting because it's, there are similar words like equality, fairness, all that kind of stuff, justice. And they use the word equity. Why is that? There was a specific meaning, I think. And that basically comes down to the distinction between equity and equality. Maybe some of you have seen this, learned this, but I'm going to tell you that from sociological and also philosophical perspective. And I'm citing these researcher Guy and McCandless work. But equity is a flexible measure of fairness, allowing for equivalency while not demanding sameness. Specifically, whatever treatment you're doing, right, for whatever the group, different groups, may not be quote unquote same, but the outcome situation where we, are very most care about are very more, fair. The equality is the opposite, or actually, it's basically about sameness in a treatment. And let's say you have like, $100, right? And between you and me, two people, we're going to divide that into two, 50-50, fair, right? That's a more equality perspective. But you go like, hey, Shane, you're a professor, like I'm a student. Is it really fair? And that's a good question, actually. That's a fair question. Right? So then I consider, you know what? I think you should take all $100. You get 100, I got 0. And maybe, you give me, well, or maybe you get 90, I got 10. Good, it's fair, maybe considering where we are in a society. Now, let's look at that right side bottom picture. I think you have seen this and it's been criticized, this picture itself too, because I'm going to tell you that later. But you see this kind of based on the same idea, equality side, there are people who are not being able to watch because there's a fence and there's a baseball game happening behind the fence, but the equality side, we treat them equally, same way, providing one box. You have only 3 boxes, right? The treatment is same here, but outcome is very different. The guy on the right side, the kid on the right side, he can't see it because he's short, right? On the equity side, we consider, existing situation. The tall guy doesn't even need a box, right? And why would we give him a box? So you basically give him 0 box and 1 box for the, medium guy and 2 boxes for the shortest person so that everybody can enjoy the baseball eventually. And that's more of an equity perspective. That treatment is not the same, but the outcome is fairer, but hopefully, right? So that's a bit of a difference here, important difference actually. Now, of course, the criticism of this picture is that why these are, persons of color visibly and, why they're outside of stadium and all that kind of stuff. There is that issue, why not just take off the fence, right? There's a whole issue. But this is helpful to think about the difference between equity and equality. Now, and that's where we want to go. But in our society, there's so many problems still we face, right? One of them is discrimination. What that is basically unjust, prejudice-based treatment of different categories of people. So usually, right, even though discrimination go from person to person, individual to individual, it's based on the fact that certain people belongs to a certain group, whether it's gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, whatever that might be. And in the field of leisure studies, there are many people who have documented different forms of discrimination that happen in a leisure context. One of those researchers is called Monica Sadowska from the University of Illinois. I studied with her too. So in 2005, she kind of, based on her research and some of the theoretical models, she created this model to explain how this discrimination happened, specifically in a leisure context, but more importantly, this individual discrimination. What she talked about, what this model talks about, is how individual level discrimination happen. For example, between you and me, I know you're a good person, but let's say you are to discriminate me based on the fact that, let's say I am Japanese, right? Now that is individual level, right? You and me. And we're going to talk about different forms of discrimination later, but that's what that's the premise here. Now, how does it happen? How does individual level discrimination happen? It begins with the general beliefs, right? Over time, from the childhood to now, because of what we learn from the media, what we learn in education, what people talk about, we develop certain stereotypes about certain groups of people, and it's very constant. I mean, it changes, but it's very constant. Doesn't change so dramatically, right? For example, Monica Sadowska's team talked about Muslim people in the States, how there's been general belief around some of the, Islam and Muslim people, the people who believe in Islam, right? Sometimes we see things that, for example, there are some extremist Muslim people that, kind of media, and people started to stereotype those things that generalize, that may apply to other people in that religious group. That's a general belief, but it's again stereotype. It's generalizing something that that doesn't have any evidence per se. Now from that step, we move on to specific attitudes at a particular time to a particular event, to a particular event. So for example, they studied down in the States after 2001 9/11, right? The terrorism attack. It was a very specific special time, especially for Muslim people in the United States. It was very, very hostile culture, right? They saw that the entire nation was very angry, frustrated, sad. That frustration, everything was directed at that religious group, right? So that's a specific attitudes, very, very hostile, for example, right after 9/11, or sometime after 9/11. And now from there you move on to basically a particular situation. Maybe a Muslim family is just hanging out at a local park, and there are other people who are not basically Muslim in this case, in the United States, and they are in this particular situation. And according to this model, what they're going to do is that they're going to engage in this potential, basically calculation between pros and cons. What are the constraints, as in like barriers, the factors that stop you from engaging in a discrimination, saying something inappropriate, for example. So actually, these are good things. Constraints are good thing, right? They're trying to stop. For example, there are, let's say you see some other people, well, maybe you don't feel like you want to do that, maybe. Or you see police, and you may feel like, well, saying some discriminatory stuff is not a good thing in front of police. Maybe not necessarily, but could be potential constraints. Or facilitators that enable you to make it easier for you to do discrimination. For example, other people are already saying some inappropriate remarks or doing an inappropriate gesture to them. And now you feel easier because, it's that group mentality, right? That you feel easier to do yourself to. And when that, basically, benefits of doing, and then the cost of discrimination actually loses against benefits and, enablers. And then that's the moment people engage in a discrimination at the individual level. Now that's an individual level discrimination, which is a very important issue. But the key here also is that discrimination is not just individual. There are other forms of discrimination, and one of the important one, and it's a little different from what chapter talked about, but institutional discrimination, institutionalized discrimination, and that's been a major discussion in our field. Sometimes organization, community, they creates the practices, policies, documents the facility, the programs, without sometimes maybe or maybe not motivated by prejudice or intention to harm, like a negative intention, yet nevertheless, those things have a negative or differential impact. Some people are treated poorly because of certain policies or facilities or whatever that might be, regardless of the intention. So it's not necessarily person to person, it's an institution, whether, for example, a government, right? Or an organization, community recreation organization, a nonprofit organization, for example, or university, higher education, those things versus individual and groups of people. What would be the example? A good example here would be, for example, FIFA. You know FIFA, right? International Federation of Football, Association of Football. Yeah, that's not English, so it's FIFA is not English originally, so it's difficult. Anyway, it's Soccer Association. Now they banned in the past wearing headscarves for soccer players in FIFA sponsored events. So that practically prohibited, especially female athletes from many Islamic cultures and society, nations. Yes, there's been protests actually. And of course, also males who from also a certain culture and religious background as well. The reason that FIFA cited back then, there are few, but one of the main one was health concern, that sometimes it could entangle your neck, people can pull, it could lead to head damage, brain damage, concussion, potential risk. You may use a certain type of pin or something that could go up, and it could be dangerous and all that kind of thing. So you can see FIFA's policy may or may not be motivated by, discriminating certain group of people. It might have been purely concerned about health. And yet, of course, if you think about it, there are soccer players who wear, a lot of people wear a necklace, which is, with their crisscross, like, Christianity, and they wear that sometimes, so. Well, there's a lot of discussion, actually, controversy about it. But as an outcome, it did have differential impact, right? It impacted a lot of Muslim women, females. Now, eventually, they lifted this, provided that those headscarves are, type of hijab, a sports hijab, and things like that, are, constructed in such a way that there's no pin that's potentially, problem, health hazard, or it doesn't, distangle, it's kind of put in a way that it doesn't, choke your neck, basically. There's some, and the material is a certain things, color has to be a certain way, things like that. But this is a good example of institutionalized discrimination as well. And the most, the reason why FIFA has been criticized and had to eventually change that policy, it's just because the fact that it could be considered, and it actually worked as institutionalized discrimination. And it happens in sports, it happens in tourism, it happens in many leisure contexts. Another key concept that we have to talk about is a privilege. Maybe you have heard about the concept called a privilege. Because sometimes the issue is not just about discrimination. Discrimination is like a negative force. Like, let's say you're running, and discrimination is like somebody trying to push you from the front and try not to get you there. And that's almost like a negative force discrimination, right? Push you down. Now, privilege is a very interesting concept that, now, in society, there are certain social groups, quote unquote, majority group, they enjoy benefits exclusive to those dominant social groups. And they're often unearned, as in they're just given. For example, people who, born with a certain condition have to use a, for example, wheelchair. And that could cause accessibility issue, right? To go to gym, for example, there's that issue, extra hurdles that they have to overcome. but other people, able-bodied individuals, we have this actually privilege and benefits to just get up and go there, walk over, and to use that gym. Did you earn it? Did anywhere like you go through competition to get that benefit? No, not that I know, not that we know, actually, right? Another classic example is the gender issue. And I'll give you my example, for example. So I am married to a Chinese woman, right? But we're both Asian. I'm from Japan, she's from China. Every time I talk to my parents, when I communicated with my parents, right? We're in the same age category, my parents and her parents, basically. My parents don't really understand what I'm doing as a professor, researcher, teacher, all that kind of stuff. They don't really understand what I'm doing, but they're okay with it. They're okay me, working hard, all that papers and research and all that kind of stuff. They're cool, right? They never question that. But my wife's parents would constantly ask her, like, okay, why would you be doing that? Why don't you come back to China? Why don't you stop working? Why don't you do, maybe, think about the baby, think about family, all that things. That's definitely tied to gender, traditional gender ideas, gender roles, gender norms, right? The fact that I am a male, especially in the Asian culture context, that exempts me from a lot of questions, quote unquote, interrogations, every time I spoke to my family, right? Of course, there's maybe some family differences, but the fact that you born into female and woman, you identify as a woman, that opens up whole hurdles, whether it's a physical, it's a tangible or a more emotional challenges or whatever that may be that you have to go through. It's almost like, you're constantly going through the hoops. Did I earn it? Did I earn that benefit when I was, I don't know, my mother's womb and just like, hey, man, boy, girl, I want to go with boy. Because it's going to be like, gender norm is going to benefit me. No, I did not. Not that I remember anyway. So that's the privilege that I have. That makes me work easier. Like I don't have to constantly worry and stress out and all that, right? Which makes me feel better about having a professional career easier, right? Potentially, which helps my career successful. With that, successful career, you may feel that, you deserve, for example, I feel I deserve to have leisure as well because of the career and work and money and all that than female counterpart potentially, right? So it's connected. Privilege does impact our life, does impact our leisure. So some people in their, race, it's not that necessarily one group is discriminated and there's so many hurdles and so many issues on the way, which is the one thing, discrimination, negative factor. In this picture, for example, female have a lot of issues. But another thing that, for example, this male counterpart, let's say, doesn't have things, right? Doesn't have too many hurdles. More importantly, let's say they are running with their wind from their back, like it's a full wind, which helps them. Now that's another thing that we also have to examine. And the catch with the privilege is more difficult to see. Because when you have it, when you have the benefits, you don't think about it. You're getting benefits out of it, but they're like, oh, thank God that I have this like status. You don't really have to, you don't think about that. And that's more difficult because when you don't think about that, we don't discuss about it, we don't change it, right? And that's why it's important. Now, this is an example of a professor called Troy Glover. Now he's located in Canada, Waterloo, but he was back in this researcher's time in the States. And he was studying a Little League baseball, like mostly boys and kids playing baseball in the States. And there's this relatively poor, predominantly African-American community. And he realized that there's no really team and activity around Little League baseball. And he wanted to understand. He talked to parents, he talked to coaches and volunteers. I think this is one coming from coach interview quotation. And the coach said, the closest park is pretty good distance when your parents don't have a transportation. That's a privilege, right? Having a car, having two cars maybe. And as I said, people are just trying to get by in that community every day, trying to survive. They don't have a time to support, to supervise their kids' play time. That's a luxury that white folks never gonna appreciate. Again, that's the characteristics of privilege. When you have that privilege, it's difficult to actually think about it because you have it. Many of our kids, he's referring to African American kids, go look after themselves and find their own things to do. Sometimes that means involved in the wrong things with the wrong people. Now that's a privilege though. Think about it. Especially for those kids. Did those kids, for example, born into the family of, let's say, African American background, or let's say the kids, a Caucasian background, born into a Caucasian family with their 2 cars so that you can get sent to or baseball practices while the other one of the parents working at and making money, and both parents don't have to work every day because single parent can support entire family, and they're living in a neighborhood where ballpark is pretty close and nicely set up, and there's so many leagues and teams, and all that. Did those kids earn that? Did they earn, did they compete to get that privileged benefit? I don't think so. When they were in their mother's womb, like oh, I want to go into this family, this is family, great family, because they have all that resources. No, I don't think so. It's unearned privilege, and that privilege does create have a differential impact in our leisure life and quality of life as well. So the privilege is a very important factor in terms of leisure and fairness. And I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to talk about next important concept called leisure constraints.